The most painful truth, perhaps the one we flee from with all the cunning disguises of consciousness, is that we do not know ourselves. And in this ignorance lies both our deepest suffering and our most unrealized potential for the human being. Unlike the stone or the tree, unlike even the instinct-driven animal, carries within a vast psychic landscape whose geography he cannot chart with the crude instruments of intellect alone. And so he is condemned to wander amidst shadows, haunted by phantoms of his own making, believing them to be the face of reality, when in truth they are nothing more than projections of what he has not yet dared to see in himself. We speak endlessly of the shadow, yet to truly confront it is to feel the unbearable weight of estrangement from oneself. For the shadow does not live somewhere outside in the world, but breathes in the cavern of the psyche, waiting for recognition, waiting for the ego to loosen its rigid grip on the fantasy of mastery. And this is why the path to knowledge of the self is not a triumphal march, but a descent, a catabasis into those regions that terrify us, regions that strip away the masks of persona and demand we acknowledge our smallness, our vulnerability, and the fact that we are lived by forces far older than our brief conscious spark. We speak endlessly of the anima and animus, yet to truly confront them is to experience the dizzying recognition that our so-called individuality is incomplete, that within us dwells the other who is not assimilated, the opposite who disturbs the fragile balance of the ego's self-image. And to meet this figure is not merely to embrace a poetic symbol, but to enter into a living dialogue with the depths, where the feminine speaks to the man and the masculine addresses the woman, challenging, seducing, undermining, yet also guiding, toward a greater wholeness that reason alone cannot bestow. We speak endlessly of the collective unconscious, yet to truly confront it is to perceive that we are not isolated islands of awareness, but temporary vessels of an ancient sea, carriers of patterns that have rippled through countless generations, and the archetypes that rise in our dreams and fantasies are not inventions of our private mind, but eruptions of a shared inheritance, timeless images that seek embodiment through us. And so when we claim to know ourselves, we speak only of a surface ripple, while beneath flows a current whose direction and origin surpass our comprehension. We speak endlessly of the ego illusion, yet to truly confront it is to endure the shattering realization that the little I we worship as sovereign is nothing more than a precarious construction, a thin raft floating atop the unfathomable ocean of the unconscious, and to cling to it as ultimate truth is to mistake the servant for the master, while to release it is to risk disintegration. Yet only through this risk may we encounter the self, the totality that holds both conscious and unconscious intention, the deeper ground from which ego itself arises. We speak endlessly of archetypes, yet to truly confront them is to feel the terror of their magnitude, for the archetype is not a lifeless concept but a living power, an energy that seizes the psyche with numinous intensity, and when one is gripped by the mother, the hero, the trickster, or the wise old man, it is as if the very marrow of existence is claimed by a drama greater than the individual. And in such moments we realize that we are not merely authors of our fate, but actors in a play scripted by forces both creative and destructive. And the only choice left to us is whether we participate consciously or blindly. We speak endlessly of dreams, yet to truly confront them is to admit that every night we are drawn into a theater where the unconscious stages its truths in cryptic symbols, weaving narratives that expose the inadequacy of our waking assumptions. And the dream does not flatter the ego, but undermines it, mocking its pretensions, revealing its blind spots, and offering images that, if taken seriously, could initiate transformation, though most prefer to dismiss them as meaningless fragments, thereby preserving the illusion of self-knowledge at the cost of genuine growth. We speak endlessly of symbols, yet to truly confront them is to accept that meaning is not manufactured at will by rational intention, but arises spontaneously from the depths. That symbols are not decorations of thought, but bridges to the unknown, carrying the weight of numinosity that touches the soul, and to engage them sincerely is to be initiated into mysteries that defy conceptual mastery, mysteries that point beyond the conscious horizon to realities that our age of skepticism has forgotten, but which continue to shape us despite denial. We speak endlessly of individuation, yet to truly confront it is to realize that the journey toward the self is not a path of comfort, but of relentless confrontation, a pilgrimage through chaos where every certainty is tested, every mask torn away, every attachment burned in the fire of necessity. An individuation does not grant us the security of becoming who we wish to be, but compels us to become what we are, even if what we are contradicts the ideals of our culture or the expectations of our family. And this demand for authenticity is intolerable to the ego that clings to approval. Hence most abandon the path long before reaching its threshold. We speak endlessly of projection, yet to truly confront it is to accept that the world we see is not the world as it is, but a screen, illuminated by our own unconscious contents. That the enemy we despise, the lover we idealize, the authority we rebel against, are all mirrors reflecting disowned fragments of our own soul. And so long as we remain blind to this mechanism, we will wander in perpetual conflict, blaming others for the darkness we refuse to integrate, until we recognize that to withdraw projection is to reclaim power, though at the price of facing the unvarnished truth of ourselves. We speak endlessly of suffering, yet to truly confront it is to acknowledge that pain is not merely an obstacle to happiness, but a necessary teacher, that every wound opens a gateway to the unconscious. Every loss dismantles the illusion of control. Every despair breaks the arrogance of certainty. And it is through the descent into suffering that the possibility of renewal arises. For only the broken heart learns compassion. Only the humbled ego learns to listen. And only the one who has passed through darkness can carry the light with authenticity. We speak endlessly of integration, yet to truly confront it is to grasp that wholeness is not perfection, but the capacity to hold contradictions without being destroyed by them, to embrace the shadow without losing morality, to honor the anima or animus without dissolving into it, to balance the archetypal powers without succumbing to possession. And integration is not a final state, but an ongoing dialogue between opposites, a tension that must be endured if the psyche is to remain alive, for stagnation comes not from conflict, but from refusal to engage with it. We speak endlessly of self-realization, yet to truly confront it is to understand that the self is not the inflated ego's fantasy of omnipotence, but the deep center that transcends the ego entirely, the axis mundi of the psyche that unites conscious and unconscious, and to experience it is to feel both annihilation and fulfillment, terror and grace, the death of the narrow self and the birth of the larger personality. And this encounter is not the end, but the beginning of a life lived in service to something greater than personal ambition. We speak endlessly of the shadow, yet the shadow speaks back in ways we cannot silence, erupting in our rage, our envy, our hidden cruelties, our secret shames. And each time we deny it, it grows more monstrous, demanding expression in symptoms, obsessions, collective violence. And until we turn to face it with humility and courage, it will rule us from behind the mask. For what is repressed does not vanish, but returns, and the failure to know oneself is the seed of individual misery and societal catastrophe alike. We speak endlessly of the anima and animus, yet their whispers shape our loves and hatreds, our ideals and prejudices, and when we disown them, they appear as figures who enchant or torment us, compelling us toward fateful encounters, for the psyche will not rest until it completes itself, and the refusal to honor the inner opposite condemns us to repeat patterns of projection, endless cycles of attraction and disappointment, until we learn to recognize in the other the face of our own soul. We speak endlessly of the collective unconscious, yet its archetypal eruptions define the myths of nations, the religions of cultures, the revolutions of societies, and when these powers are denied, they erupt in collective possession, in ideologies that sweep through masses like wildfire, leaving devastation in their wake, for the archetypes demand expression, and if they are not consciously integrated by individuals, they will possess the collective in destructive frenzy. Hence the task of knowing oneself is not merely personal, but carries the weight of humanity's fate. We speak endlessly of the ego illusion, yet the ego clings desperately to its supremacy, fearing dissolution above all. But every genuine encounter with the unconscious humbles it, reveals its dependence, and though this is painful, it is also liberating. For only when the ego acknowledges its relativity can it serve the self as mediator rather than tyrant, and thus the most painful truth, that we do not know ourselves, becomes the most fertile ground for transformation. If only we dare to descend into the unknown. If the first and most painful truth lies in our ignorance of ourselves, the second wound is found in the relentless discovery that even when glimpses of self-knowledge dawn, they reveal not stability but flux, not certainty but a ceaseless unfolding, as though the very essence of the human psyche were not a fixed entity but a process, a becoming, a story still being written by hands unseen. And in this recognition we are forced to abandon our craving for final answers, learning instead to endure the tension of opposites that define our existence. Consider the reality of time and destiny, for it teaches us that the psyche is never satisfied with mere appearances. The deeper truth emerges only when the ego is shaken by contradictions, driven into a crisis that cannot be solved by intellect alone, and in that moment something new struggles to be born, something larger than the ego, something that carries within it the wisdom of ages, though it speaks in riddles and symbols, and so the path to greater wholeness demands patience, suffering, and the willingness to let go of the illusion that we can command the depths like a master commands his servant. Consider the reality of the unconscious will, for it reveals that what we take as personal choice is often the enactment of hidden patterns, compulsions, and inherited structures that steer us as if we were instruments of a larger design, and to recognize this is both humiliating and liberating. Humiliating because it undermines our pretensions of autonomy. Liberating because it shows that life has meaning beyond the narrow aims of the conscious ego, meaning that emerges only when we learn to listen to what the unconscious seeks to express through our conflicts, our dreams, and our failures. Consider the reality of fear of death, for it confronts us with the stark recognition that consciousness is bounded, fragile, and finite, and yet this terror is also the womb of our deepest transformations, because to accept mortality is to enter into a relationship with eternity, not as an abstract dogma, but as a living experience in which each moment becomes imbued with significance, and the psyche begins to awaken to dimensions that transcend the biological span, perceiving the archetypal pattern of death and rebirth that governs not only individual life, but the cosmos itself. Consider the reality of the persona, For this mask we wear before the world is both necessary and dangerous. Necessary because without it we cannot function in society. Dangerous because when we mistake the mask for the face we lose access to the depths of our own being, and sooner or later life will conspire to tear the persona away, often through crisis or breakdown, and though this stripping is excruciating, it is also indispensable, for only then do we learn that the true self is not reducible to social roles, but is a mystery unfolding beneath them. Consider the reality of the transcendent function, that mysterious alchemy whereby the psyche holds opposing tendencies in unbearable tension until a new attitude emerges, a synthesis that could never have been foreseen, and in this we glimpse that the psyche is not merely a battlefield of contradictions, but a creative field, a living process that seeks growth through conflict. And this capacity for transformation is precisely what saves us from despair when opposites tear us apart. For if we endure the tension without fleeing into dogma or despair, something unexpected is born that redeems the suffering by enlarging consciousness. Consider the reality of myth and meaning, for modern man prides himself on having outgrown myth, yet he is more possessed by it than ever. Only now his myths take the form of ideologies, technologies, and collective fantasies that he does not recognize as mythic, and because he denies their symbolic nature, he becomes their slave. While true engagement with myth is not regression into superstition, but acknowledgement that the psyche speaks mythologically, that our deepest experiences are woven in symbolic patterns which grant meaning. And without this symbolic context, the soul withers, no matter how materially prosperous life becomes. Consider the reality of alchemy, for though it appears as a medieval superstition, it conceals a profound psychological truth, the work of transformation, the opus, the long labor of integrating the opposites within the psyche, the endless cycles of dissolution and recombination. And just as the alchemists projected their psychic processes onto matter, so we too project our inner conflicts onto the world, and the task remains to recognize in every external struggle a mirror of the inner work, a stage in the refining fire that turns unconscious chaos into conscious gold. Consider the reality of psychic wholeness. For this wholeness is not a static completion, but a dynamic balance that requires continual renewal. And the danger lies in imagining that wholeness means comfort or peace, when in truth it demands constant dialogue with the unconscious, constant sacrifice of illusions, constant willingness to confront the unknown, and only through such devotion does the psyche approximate the self, that center which is both within us and beyond us, the organizing principle of life itself. Consider the reality of the child archetype, for this image that appears in dreams and myths is not a sentimental symbol of innocence, but the embodiment of the potential yet to be realized, the future self that strives to emerge through us, fragile, yet indestructible, vulnerable, yet immortal. And to care for this inner child is to honor the process of becoming, to protect the spark of possibility against the cynicism of the ego, and to recognize that within each of us dwells a seed of transformation that longs to grow if only we allow it the soil of attention and the water of patience. Consider the reality of the inner journey. For while outer achievements may dazzle the world, they leave the soul empty if the inner journey is neglected. And this journey is not measured by external milestones, but by the deepening capacity to endure solitude, to wrestle with one's own demons, to discover within the silence a voice that is not egoic but eternal. And though the path is often lonely, those who dare it become carriers of light for others, not because they preach doctrines, but because their very being radiates authenticity born of inner struggle. Consider the reality of the illusion of progress, for our culture believes that history is a linear ascent toward enlightenment. Yet the psyche teaches us otherwise, reminding us that what is repressed returns, that civilizations rise and fall, that the shadow of humanity grows darker the more it is denied. And thus, true progress cannot be measured in technological feats, but in the degree to which individuals integrate their unconscious. For only then does collective life become less prone to the eruptions of possession that lead to war, tyranny, and destruction. Consider the reality of cosmic order, for even as the ego despairs of chaos and randomness, the deeper psyche resonates with archetypal patterns that suggest an underlying harmony, not a harmony that spares us suffering, but one that weaves suffering into the tapestry of meaning. And when we glimpse this order, we feel that life is not absurd but purposeful, that every trial is part of a larger design. And this faith is not a dogma imposed from without, but an experience arising from within. When the self communicates through dreams, synchronicities, and the quiet certainty that our lives are guided by something greater than our conscious will. Consider the reality of time and destiny, for the psyche does not measure time as the clock does, but as a spiral, where patterns repeat at higher levels, where what was unresolved returns in new forms until it is integrated, and in this spiral, we discover that destiny is not fatalistic determinism, but the unfolding of the potential we carry within. Potential that insists upon realization, even if we resist it. And thus, the painful experiences of life are often not accidents, but necessities, designed by the unconscious to push us toward the wholeness we resist. Consider the reality of the unconscious will. For when we imagine we are free, we are most bound. When we declare autonomy, we are most possessed. And only when we recognize the subtle manipulations of the unconscious do we begin to taste genuine freedom, a freedom that arises not from denial but from dialogue, not from domination but from reconciliation. And the humility of acknowledging this hidden will is the beginning of wisdom. Consider the reality of fear of death, for it strips us of illusions, and yet in its shadow blooms the deepest reverence for life. The recognition that every moment is unrepeatable, every encounter sacred, and to live with death at one's shoulder is to live authentically, freed from triviality, anchored in what truly matters. And this intimacy with death transforms existence into a mystery to be lived, rather than a problem to be solved. Consider the reality of the persona, for its collapse often precipitates the dark night of the soul, when all the roles we once clung to fall away. And though this night feels like annihilation, it is, in truth, initiation, for only in the absence of masks does the possibility of authenticity arise, and from this abyss the soul emerges reborn, less adorned but more real, less secure but more alive. Consider the reality of the transcendent function, for it shows that opposites are not enemies to be eliminated, but partners in a dance. And the psyche's genius lies in its capacity to create a third from the conflict of two, a new vision born, not from compromise, but from synthesis, and to participate in this process is to surrender the arrogance of the ego while trusting the creativity of the unconscious, which always seeks to enlarge, to heal, to reconcile. Consider the reality of The third movement of this painful truth is the dawning realization that even when we turn inward and begin to glimpse fragments of the unconscious, we do not encounter mere private fantasies, but primordial powers, archetypal forces that have shaped humanity since its beginnings. And these powers, when unrecognized, seize us, possess us, drive us into madness or ecstasy. And it is only through conscious relation to them that they become sources of meaning rather than destruction. Reflect upon the Great Mother, for here the psyche reveals its timeless drama, its mythic patterns that unfold regardless of whether we acknowledge them. And when the Great Mother manifests in dreams, visions, or cultural events, it is not a fiction to be dismissed, but a signal from the depths, calling us to recognize that our lives are woven into narratives far older than our conscious age. And only by responding to these calls with humility and courage do we avoid the fate of being swept away by archetypal storms that overwhelm both individuals and civilizations. Reflect upon the wise old man, for here the psyche reveals its timeless drama, its mythic patterns that unfold regardless of whether we acknowledge them. And when the wise old man manifests in dreams, visions, or cultural events, it is not a fiction to be dismissed, but a signal from the depths, calling us to recognize that our lives are woven into narratives far older than our conscious age. And only by responding to these calls with humility and courage do we avoid the fate of being swept away by archetypal storms that overwhelm both individuals and civilizations. Reflect upon the trickster, for here the psyche reveals its timeless drama, its mythic patterns that unfold regardless of whether we acknowledge them. And when the trickster manifests in dreams, visions, or cultural events, it is not a fiction to be dismissed, but a signal from the depths, calling us to recognize that our lives are woven into narratives far older than our conscious age. And only by responding to these calls with humility and courage do we avoid the fate of being swept away by archetypal storms that overwhelm both individuals and civilizations. Reflect upon the hero's journey, for here the psyche reveals its timeless drama, its mythic patterns that unfold regardless of whether we acknowledge them. And when the hero's journey manifests in dreams, visions, or cultural events, it is not a fiction to be dismissed, but a signal from the depths, calling us to recognize that our lives are woven into narratives far older than our conscious age. And only by responding to these calls with humility and courage do we avoid the fate of being swept away by archetypal storms that overwhelm both individuals and civilizations. Reflect upon possession by archetypes, for here the psyche reveals its timeless drama, its mythic patterns that unfold regardless of whether we acknowledge them. And when possession by archetypes manifests in dreams, visions, or cultural events, it is not a fiction to be dismissed, but a signal from the depths, calling us to recognize that our lives are woven into narratives far older than our conscious age. And only by responding to these calls with humility and courage do we avoid the fate of being swept away by archetypal storms that overwhelm both individuals and civilizations. Reflect upon synchronicity, for here the psyche reveals its timeless drama, its mythic patterns that unfold regardless of whether we acknowledge them. And when synchronicity manifests in dreams, visions, or cultural events, it is not a fiction to be dismissed, but a signal from the depths, calling us to recognize that our lives are woven into narratives far older than our conscious age. And only by responding to these calls with humility and courage do we avoid the fate of being swept away by archetypal storms that overwhelm both individuals and civilizations. Reflect upon collective crises, for here the psyche reveals its timeless drama, its mythic patterns that unfold regardless of whether we acknowledge them. And when collective crises manifest in dreams, visions, or cultural events, it is not a fiction to be dismissed, but a signal from the depths, calling us to recognize that our lives are woven into narratives far older than our conscious age. And only by responding to these calls with humility and courage do we avoid the fate of being swept away by archetypal storms that overwhelm both individuals and civilizations. Reflect upon the religious instinct, for here the psyche reveals its timeless drama, its mythic patterns that unfold regardless of whether we acknowledge them. And when the religious instinct manifests in dreams, visions, or cultural events, it is not a fiction to be dismissed, but a signal from the depths, calling us to recognize that our lives are woven into narratives far older than our conscious age. And only by responding to these calls with humility and courage do we avoid the fate of being swept away by archetypal storms that overwhelm both individuals and civilizations. Reflect upon psyche and cosmos, for here the psyche reveals its timeless drama, its mythic patterns that unfold regardless of whether we acknowledge them. And when psyche and cosmos manifest in dreams, visions, or cultural events, it is not a fiction to be dismissed, but a signal from the depths, calling us to recognize that our lives are woven into narratives far older than our conscious age. And only by responding to these calls with humility and courage do we avoid the fate of being swept away by archetypal storms that overwhelm both individuals and civilizations. Reflect upon madness and creativity, for here the psyche reveals its timeless drama, its mythic patterns that unfold regardless of whether we acknowledge them. And when madness and creativity manifest in dreams, visions, or cultural events, it is not a fiction to be dismissed, but a signal from the depths, calling us to recognize that our lives are woven into narratives far older than our conscious age. And only by responding to these calls with humility and courage do we avoid the fate of being swept away by archetypal storms that overwhelm both individuals and civilizations. Reflect upon Eros and Logos, for here the psyche reveals its timeless drama, its mythic patterns that unfold regardless of whether we acknowledge them. And when Eros and Logos manifest in dreams, visions, or cultural events, it is not a fiction to be dismissed, but a signal from the depths, calling us to recognize that our lives are woven into narratives far older than our conscious age. And only by responding to these calls with humility and courage do we avoid the fate of being swept away by archetypal storms that overwhelm both individuals and civilizations. Reflect upon the eternal return, for here the psyche reveals its timeless drama, its mythic patterns that unfold regardless of whether we acknowledge them. And when the eternal return manifests in dreams, visions, or cultural events, it is not a fiction to be dismissed, but a signal from the depths, calling us to recognize that our lives are woven into narratives far older than our conscious age. And only by responding to these calls with humility and courage do we avoid the fate of being swept away by archetypal storms that overwhelm both individuals and civilizations. The fourth unfolding of the painful truth is that self-knowledge is never a possession, but a lifelong surrender, a continual dying and becoming, where every wound is both a teacher and a doorway, every descent into darkness a hidden preparation for light. And in the end we do not conquer the self, but are embraced by it, discovering that the mystery we feared was the very ground of